Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, Napoleon Bonaparte. Imagine a man who wept because conquering 2 million square miles was not enough for him. The glory hunter, Alexander the Great, cared only for one thing: conquering the world. He threw his army into battle without fear of defeat, as if he was immortal. And why wouldn't he think that? The man was on a victory spree for 10 years. His men were tired and wanted to return home so they could enjoy the luxuries they had won. But their king cared for no riches. He didn't even care much for ruling, only conquering. It was all going well for him until he hit a wall in India. Alexander the Great, the god who fell. Alexander's story begins with ambition carved into his very bones. The son of Philip II of Macedon, he had been tutored by none other than Aristotle, absorbing philosophy, logic, and sciences, yet he always leaned toward one obsession: military conquest. From the moment he inherited the throne at just 20 years old, Alexander became a force of nature. He crushed rebellions in Greece, marched into Asia Minor, and then across the Persian Empire like a man possessed. One by one, the cities of Darius III fell before him. At Issus, he shattered the Persian army despite being outnumbered. At Gaugamela, he sealed his reputation as a general who could bend the world to his will. Everywhere he went, he founded cities, more than 20 Alexandrias, symbols of his hunger for immortality. But Alexander was never satisfied. Every new land conquered was simply a stepping stone to another. His men, who had marched thousands of miles from the Mediterranean to the heart of Asia, began to question, where does it end? By the time they reached India in 326 BCE, exhaustion weighed heavily on the Macedonian soldiers. They had marched through deserts, mountains, and endless plains, fighting countless battles, and now faced an enemy unlike any other, the mighty King Porus of the Punjab. Porus was no ordinary rival. Towering in stature and commanding an army with fearsome war elephants, he gave Alexander the fight of his life. The battle on the banks of the Hydaspes River was brutal. Alexander's beloved horse, Bucephalus, died beneath him. Alexander himself was reportedly wounded. His men were battered and broken, staring across the river at yet another massive Indian army ready to fight. This was the breaking point. His veterans, who had followed him through hell and victory, begged their king to turn back. They said, "Enough. We have marched farther than any army has ever marched. Let us return home to enjoy what we have gained." For once, Alexander, the man who never listened to anyone, was forced to comply. He wept, but he turned back, and in that moment the unstoppable conqueror discovered his first true defeat, not from an enemy's sword, but from the will of his own men. Back in Babylon, his drinking habits worsened. He drank excessively, often challenging others to drinking contests, sometimes consuming the equivalent of gallons of wine in one night. It was during one such night of revelry in 323 BCE that Alexander fell seriously ill. Fever gripped him, and within days he could no longer speak or move. His generals gathered around him, opportunists sensing the coming vacuum of power. They asked him who should inherit his empire, the greatest the world had ever seen. Alexander's answer was chillingly vague: "To the strongest." Those words were a curse. What followed was nearly 50 years of chaos, known as the Wars of the Successors, as his generals tore apart the empire he had built. Before it was even a nation, it was fractured into pieces. Greek historians wrote that Alexander's body did not decompose for 6 days after his death, a divine sign, they claimed, that he was a god. But modern science suggests another possibility. Alexander may not have been dead at all. Some believe he suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological disorder that left him paralyzed but conscious. He may have heard the whispers, the schemes, the betrayal of those around him. He may have even been buried alive. Thus ended the life of a man who lived not for empire, not for glory of nation, but for the glory of his own name, Alexander. Julius Caesar, the fanboy who became dictator. Next we have the fanboy of Alexander, Gaius Julius Caesar. While Alexander wept because conquering 2 million square miles was not enough for him, Caesar is reported to have burst into tears while reading the exploits of his idol. He told his men, quote, "When he was of my age, Alexander had conquered Darius, but up to now nothing has been accomplished by me." Caesar's obsession with Alexander was not just admiration, it was an obsession that shaped his destiny. He would model his life on the Macedonian conqueror, and in many ways he succeeded. Born into a patrician family in Rome, Caesar's early life was marked by danger. He narrowly escaped the purges of dictator Sulla. He clawed his way up the political ladder, gaining fame as a brilliant orator and shrewd politician, but it was as a general that Caesar shone brightest. In Gaul, he transformed himself from a politician into a legend. For nearly a decade, he fought tribes across modern France, Belgium, and even crossed into Britain. His commentaries on the Gallic War were not just reports, they were propaganda masterpieces, written to glorify his every move and remind Rome of his unmatched skill. But Caesar's ambition grew too large for the Republic. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army in 49 BCE, defying the Senate and plunging Rome into civil war. Victory followed victory. At Pharsalus, he defeated Pompey, once his ally, now his enemy. In Egypt, he allied with Cleopatra, cementing his power. Soon, he declared himself dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. To Caesar, power was the only law worth breaking. He famously declared, "If you must break the law, do it to seize power. In all other cases, observe it." But the Senate feared him. Rome had despised kings for centuries, and to them Caesar was becoming one. The whispers of monarchy, of Caesar crowning himself like Alexander, terrified the old guard. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate. 60 conspirators surrounded him. Daggers flashed. 23 stab wounds whittled his body. Among the attackers was Marcus Brutus, his friend, his adopted son, his most trusted ally. Seeing Brutus among them, Caesar is said to have uttered, "Et tu, Brute?" before collapsing at the base of Pompey's statue. Like Alexander, Caesar had reached for immortality. Like Alexander, his death plunged his empire into chaos. The Republic fell, and from the ashes arose the Roman Empire. But Caesar himself never wore a crown. He died reaching for it.
Genghis Khan, the Beast of the East. This takes us to the medieval era. While it was mainly famous for the Crusaders, they were overshadowed by a far greater force, the Beast of the East, Genghis Khan. Born as Temujin on the harsh steppes of Mongolia, his early life was filled with betrayal and hardship. His father was poisoned by rivals. His family was abandoned by their tribe. Temujin grew up starving, hunted, and despised. But he survived, and he vowed never to be powerless again. Through cunning alliances, ruthless betrayals, and unmatched military strategy, Temujin forged the Mongol tribes into a single unstoppable force. He became Genghis Khan, universal ruler. Unlike Alexander or Caesar, Genghis did not see himself as divine. He knew he was a tyrant and reveled in it. His infamous words chilled the bones of his enemies. "The greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love him shrouded in tears, and to gather into your bosom his wives and daughters." And he lived by those words. The Mongol conquests were apocalyptic. Cities burned, populations slaughtered. From China to Persia, rivers ran red. His empire stretched farther than Alexander's, twice as vast, covering nearly all of Asia. Yet his death remained shrouded in mystery. Some say he fell to the bubonic plague. Others claim he was shot by an arrow in battle. One story even tells of a princess from the Western Qi dynasty who castrated him in revenge, leading to his death. Why so many versions? Because his death was kept secret. To announce it would have been to invite rebellion at a critical time. The Mongols were in the midst of conquering the Western Xi, and the campaign mattered more to Genghis than his own funeral. His men carried his body in silence, slaughtering anyone who saw the procession to preserve the secret. Even in death, he brought only death. Genghis Khan left behind not just an empire, but a legacy of terror. Yet he also left systems of law, trade routes, and a united step that reshaped the world. He was no god, no savior, just a tyrant who carved the largest empire the world had ever seen. Napoleon Bonaparte, the artist of war. Fast forward 5 centuries, and perhaps the greatest conqueror to live was Napoleon Bonaparte. By Napoleon's time, the world of swords and spears had given way to muskets, cannons, and artillery. But war was still the same game, and Napoleon played it like a master. Rising from humble beginnings on the island of Corsica, he clawed his way up the ranks of revolutionary France. Brilliant, ruthless, and ambitious, he seized power in a coup d'état in 1799. Soon after, he crowned himself Emperor of the French. But Napoleon saw himself differently than other conquerors. Alexander thought himself a god. Caesar thought himself the Messiah of Rome. Genghis embraced tyranny. Napoleon saw himself as an artist of war. "I love power," he said, "but it is as an artist that I love it." To him, battles were not chaos, they were canvases, and he was the painter. His memory was legendary. He could recall the names, positions, and histories of thousands of soldiers. He maneuvered armies of hundreds of thousands with precision, sweeping across Europe like a storm. At Austerlitz, he crushed the combined armies of Austria and Russia. At Jena, he humbled Prussia. For years, he was invincible, reshaping Europe in his image. But ambition has no limits. His invasion of Russia in 1212 was a disaster. The endless winter, scorched earth tactics, and starvation destroyed his army. From there, his empire crumbled. In 1815, he made his last gamble at Waterloo. The battle was fierce, but British and Prussian forces prevailed. Napoleon was defeated, not just as a general, but as a dreamer. Exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, Napoleon spent his final years in bitter denial. He hosted dinner parties where men wore uniforms and women wore jewels, pretending he was still emperor. He lived in memory, painting battles in his mind. On May 5, 1821, he died, his final words a confession of love to the only things that ever mattered. France, the army, head of the army, Josephine. The end of the 4. Thus ended the great conquerors. One died from sudden illness, perhaps even buried alive. Another was betrayed and stabbed by his own men. A third fell, perhaps to plague, perhaps to an arrow, perhaps to a woman's revenge. And the fourth, the artist of war, died in captivity. Yet they all had one thing in common. For all their victories, for all their empires, for all the blood they spilled, they died with one desire still burning in their hearts, the desire for more.